So we've just found out that there are extra drafts of a speech that Joe Biden gave in Ukraine in December of 2015, and the White House is refusing to hand them over. Now, why is this such a huge deal? Well, it's a huge deal because it ties in with what you, Jeff, and I have been talking about for a very, very long time, namely that there's a timeline, a sequence of events which led to Joe Biden's speech in Ukraine and to Joe Biden's demand to fire the prosecutor. And you all recall that we kept being told that that had nothing to do with Hunter Biden. Well, the timeline always suggested it did. And now this new information about hiding these extra drafts basically reinforces what we already knew.
Yeah, I think to give a little bit of a backdrop for folks is worth remembering that, the DOJ had actually approved this whole issue of supporting Viktor Shokin. And somewhere in the realm of between August and November of 2015, a narrative changed materially that suddenly Shokin was a bad guy and needed to be fired. And that's why we think these drafts of the speech is so important, because in the formal process, somewhere in these speeches, it's very likely that they made material changes that may well demonstrate that narrative shift. If people remember, you had this phone call, or not a phone call, but an email, a request from Burisma, basically directing Hunter that we need to have a change. You need to do something about this prosecutor. And all of a sudden, about 3 weeks later, Joe Biden makes the first demand for Viktor Shokin to be removed. And we see that show up in one of his schedules. And in this schedule, it actually lists, like push for removal of Shokin. And the thing that goes along with that is that they say, make sure that you send this for approval to Victoria Nuland as she's leaving the next day. And it also appears, we think that, she may have played a role in helping to shift this narrative. So these drafts of this speech could prove to be really, really important because they may highlight those changes.
Yeah, exactly right. So for once, the House Oversight Committee has done something good. I think that was a very good idea to try and seek those draft speeches. So for the exact reason you mentioned, because, well, the House Oversight calls it that Biden called an audible, which is an idiom, which means that all of a sudden everything changed. And we obviously haven't seen those drafts. We've seen the final version. We've seen these demands to get rid of Shokin early December of 2015, but we don't know what did that speech look like a week earlier, 2 weeks earlier, 3 weeks earlier. The trip was planned at some point around sort of 9th, 10th November, something like that. And then things kind of happened in quick succession after that. So I think it's a very good idea to try and seek those draft speeches. Now, obviously, they were done on the government's time. Joe Biden was vice president. They were done by the vice president's office. They are public property, and the public needs to see them. I mean, there's nothing to stop that from happening. And the interesting thing is that after the House Oversight Committee went to NARA, the National Archives and Records Administration, the people who keep all these records from previous administrations, who we've heard about so much in relation to Trump and Get Trump, because he allegedly did not hand over all of his records to NARA. Well, turns out that NARA does have what the House Oversight is seeking. They've admitted that. But what they've done is they've sent it to the White House. This is ongoing, and said, hey, White House, can we release this to Congress? And the White House has obstructed that. So why would they do that if it was just some draft speeches, right? And the other interesting is they have not invoked privilege or anything like that. It's just basically stonewalling. So
yeah, when you say NARA, you're talking about National Archives, correct?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
The same people who came after Trump. So, well, they have it. I think it's really important that they have these speeches or the drafts, or they say that they have what the House is seeking. So we assume those are these draft speeches. So they have it, but they're not handing it over because they're seeking White House approval to hand it over. And the White House is not giving this approval. Why wouldn't they approve that? Just some speeches, just some edits, just some drafts.
I'm not even entirely clear why NARA would be going to the White House for approval for a prior administration, because at this point in time, Joe Biden was vice president. Now, maybe I'm mistaken on that, and that's proper procedure. But I mean, we've seen, NARA engage in a lot of questionable actions when it came to the whole Trump documents. And, the way that certain documents were black holed. And we've talked in a prior show about the back and forth that happened of trying to obtain the Trump binder with NARA, and NARA playing all kinds of games leading up to, the FBI raid on Mar-a-Lago. Everything that I've seen, leads me to believe that it's a highly politicized entity. So, again, I don't know if they have to go and ask the White House, but it seems strange because it's a prior administration.
There's probably some process where they have to or should do or whatever, and it's possible that that Biden might invoke privilege over these documents. Okay, leaving aside that somehow Trump was never afforded all these opportunities, let's just leave that aside for a moment. And let's assume that this is okay for NARA to go and ask the White House to release these documents. I still find it shocking that the White House has been obstructing this. And that leads me to conclude that there must be something in there that they don't want us to see. Because after all, I mean, they could say, oh, we know these are deliberative documents. People can't see what we were thinking, blah, blah, blah. But the point is, we know the speech. We have the speech. He gave the speech. We know what's in it. So this is just about spotting any differences from, again, a few weeks before he gave the speech to when he gave the speech, because that is the exact time period in which this whole Burisma thing was going on, in what you mentioned earlier, that Burisma was demanding all of a sudden deliverables. Specifically, this is spelled out by the head honcho there at Burisma, Vadim Požarsky. He spells it out. You must end these investigations into Burisma, and Zlochevsky, the owner. So that happened on November 2nd. And then Joe Biden gives a speech, and suddenly the prosecutor needs to be fired. And I think I've said it before, but I think it is actually a really good idea to look at these drafts. And again, if these drafts were, you just you just shifted things around, you corrected some of the language, whatever, what's the big deal? But of course, if it turns out that an earlier draft didn't mention anything about, the prosecutor, and suddenly it did, then that would be a big problem.
Yeah, and just by, again, by way of backdrop so that everybody's on the same page, there was a $1 billion taxpayer guarantee that was loan that was being made. It's not really a loan. It was U.S. is guaranteeing it, and that was made to Ukraine. And that had already been approved. So this narrative that, and then what happened, obviously, is Joe Biden later tied that loan to the removal of Shokin. Well, the approval had been given before there was any sense of a removal. There was no need for a removal of Shokin. Everything was approved. So there's this narrative that, Joe Biden was just going along with policy when, in fact, the opposite is true. He literally changed U.S. policy on the fly to get Shokin removed. And the timeline of events is really, really tight because, as you said, November 2nd is when Vadim Požarsky reaches out, Burisma's CFO, reaches out and emails Hunter and says, you got to produce deliverables. We're not making enough progress in getting this investigation squelched down. Same day, what does Hunter Biden do? He goes and he reaches out to Amos Hochstein, who's Biden's envoy, and asks for a meeting with him, which is granted. And then less than 2.5 weeks later, less than 3 weeks later, November 22nd, that's when Biden suddenly comes out with this statement demanding that Shokin be removed. And so we're talking about that interim, those 3 weeks where a speech was being crafted to see what's actually in there. Because as you said, that speech is already public. If there wasn't material changes in the earlier drafts, fundamental material changes, there'd be no reason to refuse that. I would think, if anything, they'd be happy to show that and show that the entire time that was what they were asking from start to finish.
Exactly right. And this is such an important point to highlight, the fact that Joe Biden did this unilaterally. They always talk about the interagency. Remember, so many times Trump was criticized for going against the interagency,
right,
which is one of these absolutely horrible, almost Orwellian words. What it means is different agencies of the US government come together and reach some kind of consensus. Okay, let's turn it around for once against the Democrats, deep state bureaucrats, whatever you want to call it, against that whole cabal. Let's turn it around. The interagency decided that Ukraine qualified for this $1 billion loan guarantee. That's in writing. They all got together, I think last day of September of 2015, and they hashed it out, said they qualify. No mention of firing any prosecutor, no mention of anything like that.
And specifically saying that they'd made enough progress, more than enough progress, on corruption to qualify for the loan.
Exactly. And then the interagency approved it, and even worse, and this ties in exactly with what happened to Trump back in 2019 with the Ukraine impeachment thing. The interagency said that Ukraine urgently needed the money by the end of the year because, all their liabilities and whatever. So this is the end of 2015. And then Biden held it up because of Burisma and his son's problems and Vadim Pojarski making those demands. And he held it up for a very, very long time. I mean, the money didn't flow for another 6 months or so?
The money wasn't I don't think it had reached final approval until May 15th. And the point, excuse me, the point of that is that not only did he get Shokin removed, but it was very clear that Biden was worried about what prosecutor was going to step into those shoes. And so they still withheld the funds. There's a lot of conversations that were going back and forth with, the Ukrainian government saying, hey, we did what you wanted. We need the money. And it wasn't forthcoming until finally they got rid of the interim prosecutor who replaced Shokin, and they got a full-time prosecutor who is actually a politician, not really a prosecutor, had him in place, and then they had a conversation on the phone, and then they released the money. So even that, demonstrates what was really going on.
Right. And if we, go back a bit again here, just to reinforce this point, Shokin, no one seemed to have had a problem with Shokin until Vadim Pojarski showed up. Okay, there was an NGO in Ukraine that was also not happy with Shokin, but these people, number one, are controlled. They were, whatever they said, people, they can, words can be put in their mouths. And that was funnily enough, that was, I think, on pretty much the same day or very much the same time frame that Vadim Pojarski told Hunter that these problems needed to be sorted out. So I always thought there was a kind of a connection there. But leaving that aside, no one in the US government was saying that Shokin had to be fired. It was the exact opposite. So, I mean, starting in February of that year, February of 2015, Shokin was hired because the previous guy was corrupted. This is what Goldman and all these Democrats always conflate. They say, oh, Shokin was corrupt because he took money to make a case in London against Burisma go away. No, that was the previous guy. That was the bribe paid by Burisma to the previous guy. Mm-hmm. And George Kent, the charge d'affaires over at the U.S. Embassy there in Kiev, he put that in writing. He knew about that. So the previous guy was fired because of corruption, and he was replaced by Shokin in order to fix these problems. And I think, you mentioned this earlier, but it is really worth recalling that Nuland, Pyatt, the ambassador, everyone seemed to be very happy with Shokin, no problems. Until all of a sudden that weekend around November, was it like October 31st, November 1st and 2nd of 2015, Vadim Pojarski was actually in Washington, D.C. And he had met Hunter and his entourage there. And we don't know what exactly obviously was said orally at these kinds of meetings, but it was those sequence of days, those few days where all of a sudden there was an NGO in Ukraine that said, oh, this Shokin guy is problematic, kind of out of nowhere. And at the same time, Pojarski sends his infamous email, which, by the way, we wouldn't know hadn't, Hunter left his laptop with the repair shop, anyway, in which he says that there need to be deliverables.
And, in terms of illustrating the change that happened within our government, Victoria Nuland herself sent a letter to Shokin in June, I think it was like June 9th, thanking him for all the efforts that had been made in terms of corruption. So he literally got this kind of official letter from the State Department. This is the kind of thing that officials in foreign governments would frame and have up in their office, that they've been doing such a fantastic job. So he was literally commended by Victoria Nuland, and she had Jeffrey Pyatt deliver the letter on her behalf in person to Shokin. And then they turn around and suddenly he's corrupt, just exactly as Burisma is pressing for these issues. And, you're right about this conflation. That's always been a real hot button of mine. The number of times I've tried to go after Goldman for this. It was the earlier prosecutor was a guy by the name of Vitaly Yarema, and he was utterly corrupt. And as you said, we have an email from George Kent literally saying that there was a $7 million bribe that was paid to Vitaly Yarema from Burisma. And, we even have the proof in the pudding because we know what happened. There was an active case in the UK against Burisma, but it was contingent upon getting information from the Ukrainian prosecutor's office, which was Vitaly Yarema at the time. Vitaly Yarema's office sent a letter to the UK office and said, "Oh, sorry, we don't have anything. There's no case." The UK was forced to drop everything. They thought they had a slam dunk case based on funds that they'd seized. And so it derailed everything. And Viktor Shokin then was brought in to replace Yarema. The whole case heats up all over again. And there's been this incredible effort to tar, Shokin as being the guy that destroyed that case. And it wasn't him at all.
And an incredible effort to paint it as U.S. government policy to get rid of the prosecutor.
Yeah.
Which is just not the case. I mean, we really discussed the interagency. We discussed, as you mentioned, Nuland, Pyatt, all these people. It simply was not U.S. government policy. That's just a demonstrable fact. Now, what are these drafts?
Maybe a good way to say it is it was not U.S. policy, but at some point it became Joe Biden policy.
Exactly right. And then, so what are these drafts going to show us? Well, they might show nothing. That's always possible. That doesn't change the underlying facts that Joe Biden changed the policy. It might just not be visible from the drafts. That's option one. Option two is that the drafts went from no corruption problems or no prosecutor problems or whatever, basically the interagency's point of view, and when they decided that Ukraine had qualified for the loan, to suddenly that changes kind of overnight, especially within that time frame. We're talking around kind of mid-November 2015. So we'll see. First of all, we have to get these documents. And I think as a next step, Biden or he doesn't understand. He's out of it. But, the legal people dealing with it, there were some deadlines they came up against and they just kind of let it pass. They just ignored it. I guess eventually they're going to claim privilege or, they're just going to try and stretch it out. So I suppose the third option is we'll never see the drafts.
Yeah. And, I think both you and it is important to note that, option A, that there is nothing there. That's possible, but that does nothing to exonerate. We weren't really thinking about going after the early drafts. Frankly, it's a great idea. But the fact that they're fighting it so hard, to me, is very, very suspicious, because if there was nothing there, you would think they would be happy to release them, showing, see, because, think about what Goldman could do with that kind of narrative. You guys were telling us that there was going to be something. He could take that whole thing, the fact that there were no real material changes in the speech, and he could create an entire narrative out of that, trying to vindicate Biden. The fact that that's not happening, pretty suspect to me. I'm guessing there are changes there. One of the suggestions that I made yesterday that got a little bit of a response, and I'm not sure if it's even a realistic suggestion, but I made it anyway, and that was, why don't you guys go after and subpoena Nuland? Because Victoria Nuland was intimately involved in crafting all of the schedule. She was helping to craft the response that they were anticipating questions from the media about the owner of Burisma, Mykola Zlochevsky, and the fact that, he was very clearly corrupt. And they literally were crafting questions or responses to questions, anticipating the press asking Biden, about Zlochevsky being corrupt. She was involved in crafting the responses to those questions. We know she was involved in crafting the itinerary and the speech because we have the emails, saying, make sure you send this to Nuland for final approval. So, it's another way to get around it. I can't imagine that the GOP is going to be that strong to do that, but that's another route to get to the information.
Well, their letter, in itself, it had some kind of threat in there. Don't tell us not to, don't tell us no, because otherwise we're going to have to ask you again. That's basically what they said.
Don't tell us no, or we're going to have to send another angry letter.
Exactly. That's exactly what it said. So maybe kind of to close off on this, zooming out here, anything to do with Trump, like both the Russia investigation and the Ukraine investigation, and January 6th as well. I mean, there's so many, right? But in each and every one of those instances, every single move, you talk about Nuland, right? And what she did, on the Trump side, every single move by every person back in the campaign in 2016 to do with, fake Russiagate, in Ukraine, in terms of who they went down to, who had a coffee break when, and, phone logs, and, everything about everyone involved in the White House at the time. And of course, January 6th, we saw that again. And here we can't even get just drafts of emails. We're not even digging to the point of like who met whom and what happened. Like, for instance, you mentioned Hunter went to see Amos Hochstein right after he got the demand from Burisma to shut down the investigations. Now, Hochstein was the big energy guy, the energy czar. And so what did Hochstein pick up his phone afterwards? Did he schedule meetings? Did he cancel meetings? What were his moves? Did he get on the phone with Ukraine? Why was Hochstein on the plane going to Ukraine with Biden?
I was just going to say, Hochstein was so tied in, he literally was on the flight with Biden.
Exactly. And he apparently he warned him about this whole, Burisma affair. Why haven't we heard the details of that? But, again, there's so much documentary evidence. I think the drafts of a speech are really just the top layer, and we can't even get that. Never mind any of these other layers. And that's just, basically the GOP not doing its job.
Yeah, I mean, I've always said, and I think you have as well, but that Trump was effectively impeached for Joe Biden's crimes. And, think about what was kind of the crux of going after Trump. It was supposedly that he was withholding support for Ukraine while he was asking the prosecutor to investigate Joe Biden. And the line of Joe Biden doing that, of overriding U.S. policy and unilaterally changing it and withholding aid until he got the prosecutor removed, it's so much more direct than anything Trump did. And that illustrates the way that the other side will go after, Trump or whoever with everything that they have. But when it's much more clear cut on the other side, nothing happens. And the GOP doesn't do anything to enable it. So probably continues to be our deepest frustration, is that feels like we've got maybe, 10 or 15 decent representatives in all of DC, and then it's all establishment uniparty from there.
Yeah, which is why I'm not very hopeful that we will eventually get to see these draft speeches. But, at least they've put it out there, and at least they had a good idea, and at least NARA has admitted
it is a good idea. But, I've come to the sad conclusion that all of this is just to engender enough outrage to get them votes.
Maybe as a final thought here, NARA has admitted that they exist. And remember, Joe Biden set the precedent when even if they invoke privilege, Joe Biden said Trump doesn't have privilege. Yep. He, as the current president, can decide that for past presidents. That's what he said in terms of the Mar-a-Lago stuff, right? So whoever the next Republican president is should take a page out of that playbook and say, well, I've decided that, let's assume Joe Biden claims privilege over these drafts. Well, whoever the next Republican president is should just say, I've decided, in line with Joe Biden's precedent, that there is no such privilege. And since NARA's already admitted they have this stuff, maybe eventually we'll get to see it.
Yeah.